Welcome to While We Were Distracted, the podcast where we explore topics that often get overshadowed in the rush of daily life.
Welcome back, you guys. You know how we just took a deep dive into a book from bin Laden's compound? Well, guess what? This time, we're going even deeper.
Yeah.
We found another really interesting book in there called Rogue State.
Yeah.
It's by William Blum. And let me tell you, this book is pretty critical of U.S. foreign policy. It really makes you wonder what bin Laden was doing with this book right
Yeah,
now.
it definitely is a pretty intriguing find. Finding rogue state in a place like that raises so many questions. Like, was bin Laden just looking for something to agree with him? Or was he maybe trying to learn about the U.S. from like a strategic point of view? It really makes us think about how complicated his motives might have been.
For sure. So, okay, Rogue State.
Mm.
Where to even start with this? Bloom really gets into all sorts of U.S. interventions, places like Grenada, Panama, Iraq, Afghanistan, the list goes on. And his main argument is that these interventions often caused a lot of instability and civilian casualties.
Yeah, and it's really interesting how Bloom goes into so much detail about all these different interventions. He brings up things that you don't usually hear in, the usual history books. He really presents a very different perspective, one that kind of challenges the traditional stories we hear about these events.
Absolutely. He doesn't just skim over things either. Bloom gets into the specifics. Like, for example, the bombing of a civilian shelter in Iraq during the Gulf War. He talks about how hundreds of civilians were killed in that bombing, even though the official story was that it was a military target. It really makes you question the information we're given sometimes.
Absolutely. Bloom really encourages us to think critically about where we get our information from, and to consider that there might be more to the story than what we first hear.
Right. And then there's this whole issue of the U.S. supporting repressive regimes during the Cold War. Bloom argues that the U.S., in trying to fight communism, basically ignored human rights abuses and supported dictators who helped them out.
Yeah, and he uses examples from all these different countries like Greece, Chile, and South Africa. Basically, what he's saying is that the U.S. often put its own strategic interests ahead of things like democracy and human rights.
And get this, he even says that the CIA was involved in putting Nelson Mandela in prison. I mean, that's crazy. It makes you wonder if our ideas about who the good guys and the bad guys are might be wrong.
That's what's so interesting about Bloom's work. He has all these unexpected details that make you question everything you thought you knew. He wants us to think deeper, to look beyond the surface, and question those simple stories we often believe without thinking.
Okay, so this next part is where things get even more intense. Bloom really goes after the CIA, and especially all their secret operations. We're talking assassination attempts, meddling in elections, helping coups happen, all that. And he even names names: Fidel Castro, Patrice Lumumba, Salvador Allende, all world leaders who he says were targeted by the CIA.
Bloom sees all these covert actions as a really dangerous and unaccountable part of U.S. foreign policy. He says they often make countries unstable and undermine democracy.
And he even tells the story of Dan Mitrione, a U.S. official who was training the police in Uruguay how to torture people. It's a pretty dark reminder of what the U.S. has been involved in overseas.
That's a good example of what Bloom is talking about when he talks about hypocrisy in U.S. foreign policy. He argues that the U.S. condemns human rights abuses in other countries, but then it goes and does similar or even worse things itself. It's a pretty serious accusation, and it really makes you think.
So we've got U.S. interventions, supporting repressive regimes, secret CIA activities, and that's just the beginning. It makes me wonder, how does this all relate back to the fact that this book was found in bin Laden's compound?
That's the question, isn't it? It's like we're piecing together a puzzle. Was bin Laden interested in Bloom's criticisms because it matched his own view of the world? Or was there something else he was trying to get out of it?
Right, what was going through his mind as he read this book? What parts did he agree with? And could it have affected what he did?
It's impossible to say for sure, but it's fascinating to think about, right? And it shows how important it is to understand different perspectives, even those that we might totally disagree with.
We're really just scratching the surface here. There's so much in Rogue State, so many details and arguments that we could talk about it for hours.
What we've tried to do here is give you a sense of Bloom's main points and pique your interest a little. Now it's your turn to decide what you think is most important and what other questions you want to explore.
So, what are your thoughts so far as we continue our deep dive into Rogue State? What has stood out to you? What are you curious about? Hold on to those thoughts, and we'll be right back to uncover even more.
One of the really interesting things about Rogue State is how Bloom keeps pointing out what he sees as double standards in U.S. foreign policy.
Yeah, he's saying that the U.S. is playing by a different set of rules than everyone else. condemning things other countries do, but then doing the same things themselves.
Exactly. A perfect example is the U.S.'s stance on terrorism. Bloom argues that a lot of the time, U.S. foreign policy actually creates the very terrorism that it's trying to fight. He talks about interventions, supporting repressive regimes, things that make people resent the U.S.
Right, so it's not just what the U.S. does, but also how other countries see those actions. And that perception, especially with something as complicated as terrorism, can really have some serious consequences.
Absolutely. He's saying these actions create a cycle of violence and instability, which can lead to these extremist groups.
It makes you think. Like, the things the U.S. does to fight terrorism might actually be making the problem worse.
That's right. And that's one of the reasons why Bloom's book is so interesting. He's not afraid to challenge the usual way of thinking about things and make us question what we believe.
And we have to remember, we're looking at this book knowing that it was found in bin Laden's compound. So, did he agree with these criticisms of U.S. foreign policy? Did he see them as reasons for his own actions?
We can't know for sure, but it's a really interesting question to think about. Did he maybe read this and think, yeah, that's exactly what I believe? Or did it make him question some of his own ideas?
Maybe a little bit of both. I mean, someone like bin Laden could easily pick and choose information to fit his own story, but maybe some of Bloom's criticisms bothered him.
Right. It's fascinating because we're trying to understand someone who was a complex person but also responsible for so much tragedy. And looking at what he read gives us a little peek into his worldview, even though it might be disturbing.
So we've talked about Bloom's criticisms of U.S. interventions, support for those regimes, and the hypocrisy he sees. But what about solutions? Does he give any ideas about how to fix these problems?
That's where Rogue State gets a little less clear. Bloom is much better at criticizing than giving concrete solutions. He talks about having a more ethical and restrained foreign policy, one that prioritizes diplomacy and working with other countries instead of military intervention.
So less fighting, more talking. That's different from what we usually see from the U.S.
Yeah, he sees these interventions as often making things worse, creating more problems than they solve.
Is that realistic, though? The U.S. has been so powerful on the world stage for so long. Can they really just step back and let other countries deal with their own problems?
That's a question a lot of people are still debating. Some think the U.S. has to intervene when there's a conflict or a humanitarian crisis. Others say that intervening often does more harm than good, and the U.S. should focus on its own problems.
Yeah, no easy answers there. But Bloom's book really makes us think about these questions and consider what might happen if the U.S. changes its approach to foreign policy.
And that's what makes this deep dive so interesting, right? We're not just reading a book, we're really exploring some big questions about the U.S.'s role in the world, about power, and about whether it's right to intervene in other countries' affairs.
It's a lot to think about, but that's what we're here for, to take these complex ideas and make them something that people can understand and think about.
Exactly. And to encourage you to think for yourself and come to your own conclusions. So, as we keep digging into Rogue State, what are your thoughts? What's resonated with you? What new questions do you have? Keep those in mind as we move forward.
You know, as we've been going through Rogue State, I keep thinking about those other things we found in bin Laden's compound. Do you think there's any connection between what Bloom is saying and those other writings?
That's a really good point. There are definitely some interesting similarities, especially with that document by Michelle Chossudovsky, the one about America's war on terrorism.
Oh, yeah, right. Chossudovsky really got into the history of the U.S. in the Middle East. And he wasn't afraid to point out what he saw as, like, manipulation and hidden agendas.
Exactly. Both Bloom and Chossudovsky are really critical of U.S. foreign policy, especially in the Middle East.
So do you think bin Laden saw those criticisms and thought, see, I'm right. The U.S. is this imperialistic power that wants to control the Muslim world.
It's possible. I mean, it's pretty powerful to find something that supports what you already believe. It's not hard to imagine bin Laden using these criticisms to justify what he was doing.
That's a scary thought. To think that someone like bin Laden might have used these books, even though the authors probably never meant for that to happen.
It shows us that ideas can be twisted and used in ways that their creators never intended. And it makes it even more important to try to understand different perspectives, even those that we find really disturbing. We need to understand what makes them appealing so we can stop them from being used to manipulate people.
So, after looking at Rogue State and thinking about where it was found, what's the main takeaway for our listeners?
I think the biggest thing is critical thinking. We can't just accept everything we hear, especially now when there's so much information out there. And a lot of it has an agenda. We have to question things, consider different viewpoints, and be careful of anyone who says they have all the answers.
Right, we need to figure things out for ourselves, not just let other people tell us what to think.
Exactly. And we need to remember that these big, complex problems don't usually have easy answers. Rogue State makes us think about the complexities of U.S. foreign policy. It reminds us that actions can have unintended consequences. And it shows us that other people might see the world very differently than we do.
Definitely a lot to consider. But that's what we're all about here, taking these big topics and making them something people can understand and discuss.
Exactly. And to make you curious enough to keep exploring. So as you think about these things, what other questions do you have? What other sources are you going to look at? What new connections are you going to make? Remember, this deep dive is just the start. Now it's your turn to keep going.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of While We Were Distracted. We will continue our dive into documents and books found in the bin Laden compound that have been released by CIA. To see the full dump, check the description and comments or visit the CIA library at cia.gov. Don't forget to like and subscribe for the next episode on While We Were Distracted.